At 6:42 p.m. on a quiet Thursday evening, November 12, 1981, inside the modest brick chapel of St. Matthew's Community Church on the outskirts of Akron, Ohio, a 49-year-old insurance claims clerk walked slowly across the carpeted aisle, carrying a stack of sheet music pressed against his side. The overhead fluorescence hummed with a tired, uneven rhythm, fighting the November dusk that seeped in through the narrow stained glass windows. The choir rehearsal had ended only minutes earlier, and most members were already in their cars, scraping early frost from their windshields. He locked the side door out of habit, straightened a row of metal folding chairs without thinking, and paused at the altar rail to gather a few stray pages left behind. At that moment, his life retained the ordinary simplicity that had defined it for decades. A stable job, a familiar congregation, a predictable circuit of work, church, grocery store, and home. What he did not know was that folded between two of those choir sheets lay a signal that would mark the beginning of a counterintelligence investigation already moving, quietly, patiently, and with calculated precision, around the edges of his routine. Within months, the small-town life he had carefully maintained would be dismantled, piece by piece, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the uncovering of a secret that had grown in the shadows of his everyday existence. This is the story of how an unremarkable church choir, tucked inside a working-class neighborhood in America's industrial heartland, became the unsuspecting cover for a KGB spy ring. Of how an ordinary man, with ordinary habits and ordinary fears, found himself entangled in covert signals, coded exchanges, and the slow tightening grip of counterintelligence surveillance. Of how the Cold War reached into communities that believed they were far removed from geopolitical struggle. And of how a deception that began with ideology eventually collapsed under mistrust, pressure, and a chain of small mistakes. It is a story about loyalties stretched thin between home and obligation, about agencies that watched quietly from the periphery, and about the families left behind when secrets finally surfaced. In the broader landscape of the Cold War, this case never made national headlines, but according to declassified FBI records, it represented one of the most unusual infiltration strategies ever observed. A network that hid not in government buildings or defense plants, but in the harmonies of a church choir. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, communities like the one surrounding St. Matthew's were shaped by factory shifts, modest houses, and predictable weekly rituals. Choir rehearsal every Thursday offered a familiar slice of routine. Folding chairs arranged in semicircles, a battered upright piano on the left side of the sanctuary, a box of hymnals stacked neatly beside the pulpit. For many members, the choir served as a social refuge as much as a religious one. They arrived after long work days, still wearing name badges from grocery stores, machine shops, or local offices, greeting one another with quick nods as they draped coats over the backs of chairs. Rehearsals ended with brief conversations about coupons at the nearby supermarket or updates on children's school events. No one suspected anything unusual in the way the choir functioned, and no one gave much thought to the quiet, slightly reserved new tenor who had joined in early 1979 and blended easily into the background. His real name would later appear in redacted case files, but in the congregation he was simply known as a polite man who rarely missed rehearsal, always carried his music sheet folder, and volunteered to help stack chairs after practice. According to neighbors interviewed years later, he kept to himself but was unfailingly courteous, mowing his small lawn at consistent hours, buying groceries on Tuesday evenings, and walking home from the bus stop with the same even pace regardless of weather. Nothing about him suggested clandestine activity. Yet FBI analysts would eventually note that his arrival in Akron coincided precisely with a known KGB placement pattern: relocation to a mid-sized American city, establishment of a plausible work history, and gradual integration into a stable community group where coded exchanges could blend seamlessly into routine interactions. The first hint of abnormality emerged in February 1981, though at the time it passed unnoticed by everyone except a single parish volunteer. She recalled seeing him linger near the choir storage cabinet longer than usual, carefully sliding his folder onto the shelf before stepping away. Moments later, another choir member approached the same cabinet, retrieved a folder that was not his own, glanced around the sanctuary, and slipped it into his coat before leaving through the side entrance. The volunteer assumed it was a mix-up. People often grabbed the wrong folder after rehearsal. But FBI files, declassified decades later, reveal that this exchange matched a pattern of signal traffic consistent with low-risk courier handoffs. Throughout the spring of that year, several similar exchanges occurred, each subtle enough to disappear into the natural movement of a church community. A folded newspaper left on the third pew, a bottle of choir room disinfectant positioned at a slightly different angle, a thin strip of red tape on the edge of a hymn book that would vanish by the next rehearsal. These were not dramatic acts. They were quiet signals, markers used to confirm safe conditions for communication, to indicate completed tasks, or to direct members of the network to dead drop sites hidden far beyond the choir room. According to later FBI analysis, the dead drops were located in places almost absurdly ordinary: behind a loose brick in the church's rear exterior wall, beneath a rusted air vent on the backside of a 1970s municipal maintenance shed, and inside a hollow space beneath a discarded Christmas decoration in the church basement storage room. The materials exchanged were modest: small pieces of microfilm, coded notes written in faint pencil on hymn book margins, and short sequences of numbers referencing radio broadcasts from a Soviet number station. Nothing within the choir's weekly rhythm would have suggested that these quiet members were engaged in espionage. In April 1981, the FBI's Cleveland field office received an anonymous tip alleging foreign influence activity connected to an Akron church. The tipster did not name the church or describe the individuals involved, but the phrasing matched language used by informants familiar with Soviet clandestine procedures. Agents began standard preliminary inquiry, reviewing travel patterns, immigration histories, and employment records for several hundred individuals across the region. Outwardly, nothing changed at St. Matthew's. The choir continued its rehearsals, members exchanged recipes, church announcements, and modest social chatter. But according to surveillance logs declassified years later, the FBI had already begun quiet observation of the neighborhood surrounding the church. By midsummer, agents noticed a recurring pattern linked to the quiet tenor: a consistent Tuesday evening route that took him past the same series of residential blocks before he reached his apartment complex. He often paused near a municipal utility pole, adjusting his coat or checking his watch. It was an action so small that no passerby would have found it unusual. Yet photographs taken by surveillance teams revealed that each pause coincided with the appearance or disappearance of a small plastic bag wedged into the metal base of the pole. Sometimes it contained nothing more than a folded scrap of choir sheet music with a single pencil mark on the margin. But other times, the bag contained tightly rolled microfilm segments, matching the type used by Soviet operatives during that era. Despite these findings, the FBI maintained a cautious pace. Community spaces like churches demanded sensitive handling, and the behavioral indicators, while troubling, remained circumstantial. But in late August, everything shifted when a routine review of public library records flagged a pattern associated with proxy research techniques commonly employed by KGB cutouts. The tenor had repeatedly checked out the same hymnal reference guide, yet kept it for unusually short periods, often only a few hours. When agents examined the book, they found faint impressions on certain pages, impressions left by a hand pressing down while writing on a paper atop it. The impressions formed numerical sequences, later determined to correspond to cipher keys for decoding number station transmissions broadcast during specific nighttime intervals. The realization that a cipher system was being constructed within the context of a choir routine elevated the case from preliminary inquiry to active counterintelligence operation. In October 1981, the FBI formally designated the investigation as Operation Silent Chapel, a code name chosen to reflect the incongruity of espionage hidden in a peaceful religious setting. The operation's primary objective was not immediate arrest, but patient observation, with the goal of identifying the full extent of the network, handlers, couriers, safe house contacts, and any unknown participants embedded within the choir or extended community. The tenor, meanwhile, went about his daily routine unaware that surveillance had expanded. He continued attending rehearsals, adjusting the alignment of chairs, carrying his music folder with the same consistent grip. But subtle changes began to appear in his behavior, the type that Cold War investigators often recognized as signs of internal pressure. He began arriving earlier than usual, sometimes sitting in his parked car for long minutes before stepping out. He checked the rear window blinds of his apartment more frequently. He shortened certain bus commutes by choosing different routes, even when they added time. These small deviations, insignificant to casual observers, suggested to trained analysts that he was responding to stress, possibly from directives issued by his handlers, or from a growing suspicion that the environment around him had shifted in ways he could not yet define. Neighbors remarked later that he spoke less during casual encounters. One recalled a moment when he dropped his grocery receipt, stooped to pick it up, and seemed to pause with his hand on the concrete for an unusually long second before standing again. Another remembered seeing him circle the mailboxes of his apartment complex twice before opening his own. Such details would not have mattered in another context, but in the slow, deliberate cadence of counterintelligence work, they served as indicators, clues pointing toward a clandestine life, held together by the fragile balance between routine and secrecy. Meanwhile, the choir director at St. Matthew's, unaware of the investigation, welcomed several new members ahead of the church's annual winter performance. Among them were two individuals whose applications had been submitted only weeks earlier, both of whom passed background checks that were typical for volunteer positions, but superficial by intelligence standards. In reality, the FBI had placed them within the choir under non-official cover to observe interactions, monitor folder exchanges, and document subtle signals that might otherwise be missed. One agent later wrote in the declassified memo that the environment felt as fragile as glass, a place where a misinterpreted glance or misplaced question could shatter months of careful observation. Throughout November, Operation Silent Chapel intensified its focus on identifying dead drop patterns. Agents noted a recurring signal, a hymnal placed upside down on the third pew from the front. When positioned that way during rehearsal, it indicated that a drop behind the loose exterior brick had been completed. When placed right side up, it signaled that the drop was to be used within the next 48 hours. These details emerged only after weeks of patient observation. Agents sitting in parked cars outside the church, tracking when lights turned on and off, monitoring the tenor's movements before and after rehearsal, and discreetly photographing the sanctuary through partially opened side doors. The crucial turning point came in early December 1981, though at the time neither the choir nor the congregation sensed anything amiss. A snowstorm had settled over Akron, coating the church steps with a thin, crunchy layer of ice. The tenor arrived unusually late for rehearsal, carrying not his usual music folder, but a plain manila envelope pressed beneath his coat. Surveillance units recorded that he paused briefly inside the vestibule, glanced at the rows of boots lined neatly along the wall, and hesitated before stepping into the sanctuary. The hesitation lasted only a second, but for analysts reviewing the footage, it indicated a moment of internal conflict, a slight fracture in the quiet certainty with which he usually moved. What happened next would set the stage for the unraveling of the spy ring in the months that followed, marking a shift from routine covert exchanges to a sequence of miscalculations that would ultimately expose the entire network. By the second week of December 1981, the patterns surrounding the tenor's movements had become sharper in the eyes of Operation Silent Chapel's analysts. The manila envelope he carried that snowy evening remained at the center of the FBI's attention. Not because of its appearance. It was the sort of envelope that could hold financial papers, church announcements, or routine insurance documents. But because of what happened immediately after he arrived. According to surveillance logs, he placed his coat neatly over the back of a chair in the sanctuary, withdrew the envelope just far enough to confirm its position, and then returned it beneath a fold of his coat, as if reconsidering its placement. For the next 17 minutes, he moved through the sanctuary with an unusual rigidity, adjusting chairs, checking hymnals, and pausing near the third pew where signals had been previously documented. But he did not perform the usual gestures that would indicate a signal for a dead drop. Instead, FBI agents later concluded that this hesitation resulted from a breakdown in communication from his handler. Within KGB protocol, missed signals could mean anything: arrest, defection, surveillance, or a strategic withdrawal. In cases involving church groups, where interactions blended into the slow rhythms of community life, timing was everything. If a signal intended to instruct the tenor to place the envelope in a dead drop location was delayed or compromised, the risk of exposure increased dramatically. Analysts reviewing Silent Chapel's communication intercepts noted that a particular number station broadcast from the previous week had deviated slightly from the expected pattern. The tonal interval, a seemingly insignificant shift to an untrained ear, carried implications for agents trained in acoustic cipher interpretation. It meant that either the handler had changed procedures or that something had disrupted the chain of communication. While the choir rehearsed Christmas hymns, their voices rising and falling beneath the sanctuary's high ceiling, the tenor remained withdrawn. According to one member interviewed years later, he sang without breath that night, coming in late on several measures and pausing during bars that usually carried straightforward rhythms. But at the time, the choir attributed it to nerves, fatigue, or perhaps the cold weather settling into his sinuses. Nothing in their world suggested espionage. They were volunteers preparing for a winter performance, marking up sheet music, comparing jacket sizes for the Christmas coat drive, and reminding one another about the Sunday bake sale. The tenor's distraction seemed out of character, but not alarming. After rehearsal ended, he stayed behind longer than usual. Surveillance teams noted that he waited until the last 3 choir members had walked to their cars before he slipped into the narrow hallway behind the sanctuary, where boxes of seasonal decorations were stacked from floor to ceiling. He moved one box aside, the same box later identified in FBI files as the cover for a hollowed-out compartment used as a dead drop, and reached for the manila envelope. But then he froze again, holding the envelope halfway between his coat and the box. After several seconds, he returned the envelope to his coat, replaced the box without opening it, and left through the rear exit. Snow had begun to fall more heavily, gathering in thin lines along the edges of the asphalt, and he walked away with a pace so deliberate that surveillance agents later described it as measured to the point of unnatural. This moment marked the first documented stall in the network's usual communication rhythm. And within counterintelligence work, stalls were often more revealing than completed exchanges. In the absence of action, internal fractures began to show. By mid-December, the FBI noted a shift in the tenor's daily routine. He stopped taking his usual bus route and began walking to work through residential streets he had never used before, frequently turning his head to scan reflective surfaces, store windows, parked cars, stainless steel panels near utility stations. These behaviors, common among individuals trained in surveillance detection routes, indicated that he believed he was being followed. But because Operation Silent Chapel had, up to that point, avoided direct physical proximity, analysts concluded that his suspicion stemmed from some internal disruption within the spy ring, not from visible FBI pressure. Meanwhile, two other choir members, the ones who had previously received or passed messages, began altering their behavior as well. One started arriving at rehearsals with noticeably fewer personal items, carrying only a thin folder instead of the usual satchel of music books. The other began leaving the sanctuary immediately after each session, avoiding post-rehearsal conversations, and no longer helping to store chairs. Surveillance memos describe these changes as coordinated withdrawal behaviors, patterns observed in networks preparing for shutdown, emergency exfiltration, or internal purges. During this period, the FBI increased its interception of mail and local phone traffic connected to the church community. While most communications involved holiday plans, grocery coupons, and routine church business, analysts isolated 3 calls involving coded language disguised as mundane conversation. A woman in the choir received a short call asking whether the alto harmonies for the final verse were ready for review, phrasing that matched previous predetermined code meaning prepare extraction site. Another received a call about borrowing a casserole dish, a code used by Soviet operatives to signal the relocation of microfilm. But the most significant call came from a payphone located near a laundromat 3 miles from the church. According to audio logs, the caller, unidentified at the time, spoke a single sentence before hanging up. "The festival won't need the extra voices this year." The line went dead. In KGB emergency lexicon, this sentence meant, "Cease operation. Burn remaining channels. Prepare for isolation." When analysts cross-referenced this message with the tenor's recent behavioral changes, Operation Silent Chapel escalated from passive observation to active disruption phase. On December 19th, the FBI authorized full-spectrum surveillance, including nighttime photography, expanded dead drop monitoring, and the deployment of a mobile technical interception unit disguised as a delivery truck. For the first time in the investigation, the objective shifted from merely mapping the network to containing it. The tenor sensed the pressure even without knowing its source. In the final week before Christmas, he began checking the church door before entering, pressing his ear lightly against the wood as though listening for movement inside. He also changed the way he handled his sheet music. Instead of casually carrying his folder under his arm, he gripped it tightly with both hands, fingers curled inward. One agent, observing him from a van across the street, noted that he walked like a man carrying something fragile that he no longer trusted to stay intact. According to later FBI psychological analysis, this was a classic sign of internal compartmental breakdown, the point at which a covert operative no longer believes in the stability of the system that supports him. All of these small fractures culminated in a critical moment on December 22nd, during the choir's final rehearsal before Christmas Eve service. Snow had continued falling across the city, layering the church parking lot with uneven patches of ice. The choir director arrived early to warm up the sanctuary and found the tenor already inside, sitting alone in the dim light, his coat still buttoned and his folder unopened on his lap. When the director greeted him, he responded with a delayed nod, as if pulled from somewhere far away. During rehearsal, he sang inconsistently, barely voicing the lower harmonies. Several members noticed that he seemed distracted, but none questioned him. Instead, they focused on preparing for the upcoming service, where they would perform a medley of traditional Christmas pieces in front of nearly 200 congregants. Their concerns were seasonal, familiar, grounded in community life. Whether the microphones would work, whether children would... But the tenor's concerns were different. Surveillance footage reveals that he repeatedly glanced at the third pew, where the hymnal used for signaling had been placed. It was upright, an indication that a dead drop was scheduled within 48 hours. Yet the tenor did not move toward the signal. Instead, he avoided it, positioning himself on the opposite side of. That evening, as the choir dispersed, the tenor lingered again near the storage hallway. This time, he reached behind the seasonal decoration box, retrieving not the manila envelope from before, but a small metal container, roughly the size of a cigarette case. He examined it briefly, his thumb brushing the edge where the lid met the base, and then slipped it into his coat pocket. According to FBI documentation, this container held microfilm strips containing radio cipher keys, possibly intended for destruction or emergency transfer. He exited the church by the side door, stepping carefully across the icy pavement as the wind pushed thin sheets of snow across the lot. Surveillance teams followed at a distance as he walked toward his apartment, taking an erratic route that suggested he was attempting a makeshift surveillance detection pattern. He paused near a mailbox cluster, scanning the parked cars nearby. But he did not notice the unmarked FBI sedan idling half a block away, its occupants trained to blend into the quiet winter streets. Back in Washington, analysts monitoring Operation Silent Chapel reviewed the evening's footage and identified this retrieval as a point of escalation. The tenor was clearly preparing for an emergency procedure. Whether he intended to destroy the materials or relocate them to a secondary dead drop was unclear. But one thing was certain: the stability of the network had dissolved. The only question now was whether the FBI would intervene before the ring attempted extraction or signal disruption. 3 days later, on December 25th, Christmas morning, the tenor performed a ritual that would draw the operation into its next phase. Surveillance teams recorded him leaving his apartment earlier than usual, carrying a paper bag that appeared to hold ordinary items, possibly Christmas donations, possibly grocery items. But instead of walking toward the bus stop, he walked in the opposite direction, toward a wooded patch near the old rail line. The path he chose was rarely used in winter, the snow untouched except for the narrow line of animal tracks. He walked slowly, occasionally stopping to adjust the bag in his hand, and eventually reached a small concrete drainage tunnel, partially buried beneath snow and dead leaves. Inside that tunnel he knelt briefly, placing the paper bag against the concrete wall. He removed the metal container from his coat, wrapped it tightly in plastic, and hid it inside the bag. He then slid the bag into a gap between the concrete and the frozen ground. The movement was practiced, steady, almost automatic. But according to analysts, the placement was sloppy compared to his previous precision. He left snow disturbed in a wide arc around the tunnel entrance. He did not cover his tracks on the way out. He lingered for several seconds at the entrance, looking down at the tunnel floor, as though unsure whether he should retrieve the bag again. Within hours, Operation Silent Chapel had the bag in its possession. But the tenor would not learn this until much later, when a sequence of events, rapid, unavoidable, and shaped by decisions now far beyond his control, would expose the network in full and tear through the quiet community that had unknowingly harbored it. In the days following Christmas morning, the tenor's world narrowed into a quiet, brittle tension he could neither name nor escape. According to FBI records, he followed his routine with greater rigidity than ever, leaving his apartment at the same early hour, returning by the same route, opening and closing his blinds with mechanical repetition. Whatever instructions he had once relied on from his handlers had gone silent. No new signals appeared in the number station broadcasts. No coded messages slipped into hymnals. No repositioned objects in the sanctuary or the storage hallway. Silence itself had become the new message, and for a man trained to interpret absence as danger, every hour without direction deepened the. What the tenor could not know was that Operation Silent Chapel had shifted decisively into its containment phase. The retrieval of the metal container on Christmas Day, the microfilm wrapped in plastic, hidden in the paper bag, provided the FBI with enough material to identify several cipher keys, 2 Soviet couriers, and at least one local cutout who had not yet appeared in surveillance logs. Though some microfilm strips had been partially damaged by moisture, the recovered keys confirmed that the choir had served as a signaling hub for a broader regional network, one connected not only to Akron, but to Cleveland, Toledo, and possibly Detroit. On December 28th, surveillance teams noted a new behavior. The tenor began checking his mailbox multiple times each afternoon, not just once. He opened envelopes immediately, sometimes standing in the cold, sometimes returning inside only to emerge moments later. According to FBI behavioral analysts, this pattern reflected a deepening fear that communication lines had collapsed. For covert operatives, missed messages do not simply create uncertainty. They create a vacuum that pulls paranoia into every corner of daily life, filling routine moments with the oppressive weight of imagined surveillance. This behavioral spiral often precedes desperate decisions, burning documents, abandoning safe-house routines, attempting extraction without authorization, or making contact with individuals outside the operational network. During these days, choir members later recalled that he appeared unusually pale, his eyes unfocused during casual conversations, his voice quieter than usual. At rehearsal on December 29th, he held his folder tightly against his chest, barely singing, arriving late and leaving early. The choir director, puzzled, considered asking if he was unwell, but decided against it. It was the holiday season, people were tired, the winter weather had been punishing. Only later, after the investigation became public, did she realize that his discomfort had been rooted not in seasonal fatigue, but in the collapse of an entire clandestine infrastructure beneath his feet. By the first week of January 1982, Operation Silent Chapel entered its decisive stage. With confirmation that the network had begun emergency shutdown procedures, the FBI prepared targeted interviews under the guise of routine community outreach. Agents posing as municipal surveyors knocked on choir members' doors, supposedly gathering information about neighborhood improvements. Their real purpose was to observe reactions, tone of voice, hesitation, inconsistencies in responses. Most members responded casually, checking boxes on clipboards and closing their doors without a second thought. But two members displayed subtle tells. One repeatedly asked whether the survey was mandatory, while another stepped back into the shadows of her hallway, answering questions with clipped phrases. These reactions matched the behavioral indicators of individuals trained to compartmentalize information while under unofficial scrutiny. Still, the tenor remained the central figure. His movements grew increasingly erratic. Surveillance reports note that on January 4th, he left his apartment shortly after 5 a.m., walked 4 blocks in the freezing dark, stopped abruptly near a bus shelter, and then returned home without boarding any transportation. Later that morning, he repeated the same half journey, this time carrying a small grocery bag. He placed the bag near a newspaper box, stepped back as though expecting someone to retrieve it, waited for nearly 3 minutes, then picked it up again and walked away. The bag contained nothing of significance, only tangerines and a loaf of bread, but analysts concluded that he was testing whether he was being watched. On the evening of January 6th, the tenor performed one final act that would accelerate the timeline of the entire investigation. Surveillance teams observed him entering the church alone, long after dark, using a spare key he had been given months earlier during a choir event. Inside, he walked directly to the sanctuary, turned on only the small overhead lights near the choir risers, and removed several hymnals from the third pew. He opened them, turning pages slowly, as if searching for something that should have been there but was now gone. One hymnal still bore faint impressions of pencil marks on its margin, remnants of coded sequences he had once written. He traced these indentations with his thumb, then set the hymnal down with a quiet deliberateness that agents later described as resignation made visible. He then moved toward the storage hallway, opened the door, and stood motionless in the threshold. The box used for dead drops sat exactly where it always had, its faded cardboard edges softened from years of being moved and stacked. But he did not touch it. Instead, he leaned against the hallway wall, pressing his hands flat against the cool, painted surface, closing his eyes for several seconds. It was the first moment in weeks where his posture suggested a kind of emotional exhaustion, though expressed not through dramatic gesture, but through a stillness so complete that even the surveillance footage seemed to hold its breath. FBI analysts reviewing the video identified this moment as a psychological breaking point. In covert networks, the absence of direction is often more devastating than hostile action. When handlers disappear, when signals stop arriving, when once reliable routines collapse without explanation, operatives face not only operational failure, but spiritual disintegration. The tenor's stillness in the hallway was not simply fatigue. It was the quiet unraveling of a man who had lost the anchor points of a life he had built on secrecy. On January 10th, Operation Silent Chapel delivered its final directive: initiate Phase Omega, contain, isolate, apprehend. The plan unfolded with the muted precision characteristic of Cold War counterintelligence operations. Agents monitored the tenor's movements for 2 days, waiting for a point when he would be alone, but not moving unpredictably. That moment arrived on the evening of January 12th, when he stepped out of his apartment holding a small duffel bag and walked toward the bus stop. He checked over his shoulder several times, his breath visible in the cold air. He held the strap of the duffel bag tightly, and surveillance analysts suspected it contained materials for destruction, possibly the remaining cipher sheets or pieces of microfilm. When the bus arrived, he boarded, choosing a seat near the back. An undercover agent boarded seconds later, taking a seat 3 rows ahead. 2 unmarked vehicles followed the bus as it made its slow way through the quiet winter streets. At 7:18 p.m., the tenor pulled the signal cord and stepped off at an intersection near an empty field, a place where he sometimes walked alone in the evenings. Snow crunched beneath his shoes as he began crossing the lot, heading toward the tree line. That was when the agents approached him, calmly, deliberately, without theatrics. According to later reports, they identified themselves quietly, displaying credentials with the professional detachment characteristic of federal operations. The tenor froze, the duffel bag slipping slightly from his grip. He did not run, he did not speak. He simply looked at the ground, his shoulders tightening as though bracing against a force that had nothing to do with the cold wind pressing against his coat. During the transport to the field office, he remained silent. The duffel bag revealed only ordinary items: clothing, toiletries, a half-used notebook. But in the inside pocket of his coat, agents found a folded piece of paper containing a 5-digit sequence, corresponding to one of the cipher keys recovered from the paper bag in the drainage tunnel. It served as the final link, connecting him unequivocally to the network. The arrest triggered a cascade of events over the following 48 hours. Agents interviewed the 2 other choir members who had displayed suspicious behavior. One denied any involvement, but displayed signs of acute anxiety. The other broke down after several hours of questioning, providing partial information about the network's operations, how signals were passed, how dead drops were selected, how microfilm was transferred. She did not know names or higher-level objectives. Compartmentalization had shielded her from broader awareness. But she confirmed that the choir had been a deliberate cover, chosen precisely because it appeared so unthreatening. No one suspects a choir. No one watches a church. By January 15th, the spy ring was effectively dismantled. Several individuals connected through peripheral roles were brought in for questioning. None faced severe charges, as most had acted as unwitting conduits or had limited contact with operational materials. The tenor, however, faced significant accusations under statutes related to espionage, foreign agent activity, and the transmission of national defense information. the FBI prepared a case built on microfilm evidence, surveillance logs, coded communications, and witness testimony. Yet the most striking element of the investigation did not come from the evidence itself, but from the quiet tragedy that unfolded within the tenor's personal life. According to interviews conducted later, his sister, one of the few relatives he kept in contact with, arrived at the field office after learning of his arrest. She described him as a man who always tried to stay invisible, someone who avoided conflict, who worked long hours, who rarely took vacations, who looked exhausted every Christmas but never explained why. She had believed his tiredness came from work. She had never suspected it came from a double life lived beneath the cover of routine. Meanwhile, members of the St. Matthew's Choir reacted with disbelief as news leaked through local channels. For them, he had been a quiet man who stacked chairs, carried sheet music, and sang with a voice that blended into the harmonies. The idea that their sanctuary had been used for covert exchanges felt unsettling, not only because of the espionage, but because it forced a reevaluation of what they believed to be safe, familiar, and constant. Afterward, some choir members admitted they avoided the third pew for months. Others said they no longer looked at hymnals the same way, noticing every pencil mark where once they had seen only music. The tenor cooperated partially with investigators, confirming some procedural details but withholding names of handlers. He appeared detached, answering questions with the calm resignation of someone who had expected this outcome long before it arrived. According to a psychological assessment filed during the investigation, he displayed significant internal conflict between ideological loyalty and personal isolation, a phrase that captured the essence of his path. He had not been driven by malice or personal gain. He had been driven by a belief, one that had gradually eroded, leaving him stranded between a cause he no longer trusted and a life he could no longer return to. He was sentenced later that year, receiving a lengthy prison term consistent with espionage statutes of the era. The courtroom proceedings were quiet, lacking the sensationalism that characterized larger Cold War spy scandals. There were no newspaper headlines, no public demonstrations, no dramatic statements from foreign governments. His case passed through the system like a faint ripple in a vast geopolitical current, noted by a handful of intelligence professionals, and then filed away. St. Matthew's Community Church continued its services. The choir eventually regained its rhythm, though for months afterward members reported a lingering unease, an awareness that the quiet sanctuaries of everyday life could harbor secrets shaped not by faith or community, but by the long shadow of global conflict. In the decades that followed, Operation Silent Chapel remained mostly classified. Only fragments of the investigation surfaced in declassified memos, surveillance routes, coded exchanges, references to microfilm hidden in ordinary objects. But the essence of the story endured among those who had worked the case, that even the most ordinary places can become theaters of espionage, that the Cold War unfolded not only in embassies, military bases, and government offices, but in small churches, suburban neighborhoods, grocery stores, and choir rehearsals where people believed they were safe. And as one retired agent later reflected in an interview, the tenor was not an exceptional spy. He was an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary system, someone whose life gradually bent beneath the weight of secrecy, until the quiet routines he depended on became the very patterns that exposed him. In the end, the story of the choir spy ring was not one of dramatic betrayals or sensational revelations. It was a story of subtle signals, ordinary gestures, and a man who hid too well in a place that was never meant to contain a secret of that magnitude. It was a reminder that during the Cold War, the line between normalcy and betrayal often ran through the most unremarkable corners of everyday life.